hear me now? This is the second.
Put it right up to your mouth.
Chin, chin, chin. I want to welcome you. A lot of new faces and a lot of, I won't say old faces. They asked me if I was a new patient the other day. I said no, I'm not a patient. This year's Theologian Residence Program series, I have to be really close. Okay. Lucky you're not going to hear me. Our series this year was meant to be a reflection on the expansive and inclusive and even cosmopolitan nature of a lot of spirituality that we are all reading. Many spiritualities are manifesting this, and we're reading them. And clearly, one of the best expressions of that, certainly the most prolific and the best known, is Richard Rohr, for an inclusive and expansive spirituality. And what we hope to do in this series was to reflect on that phenomenon and to hear from those spiritualities and do some critical reflection on them, if possible, together. And Dr. Robert Ludwig from Chicago, Loyola University in Chicago, his first presentation, he really set a context for the writings and the teaching of Richard Rohr, showing that mysticism, especially Richard Rohr's mysticism, that it's a pervasive theme that goes right through the history of Christianity, even starting with the Jewishness of Jesus. It's hard for us to realize that Jesus wasn't a Christian, he was a Jew. Bob explained all that the other night. So, and also how we got it wrong sometimes, and we forgot the mystical part at times. And Richard Rohr is one of the people trying to reclaim that tradition. So tonight, Bob is going to speak more specifically about some individual themes in Richard Rohr. And I told him we loved his talk the other night, and he said, that's really great for my ego. I'm not sure it's good for my true self, though. So, the topic tonight is finding your true self, 4 noble truths for Christians. Please welcome Robert Ludwig.
Thank you so much, Joe. I just want to get my clicker over here. Thank you so much, and again, my heartfelt thanks to the Theologian in Residence Program, Helen Day, to Jim Reed, and to Joachim for making all these arrangements and for the hospitality you've shown. This is it's wonderful. It's wonderful to be back in Colorado, and it's wonderful to have an opportunity to spend time with a group like you. I was telling Joe how impressed I was by how attentive and thoughtful. And by the way, I'm trying to set you up for tonight, too. How attentive and thoughtful and present you were to the conversation. So hopefully we'll have something like that again tonight. So, on Friday night we talked about Christianity as a mysticism, as essentially a mysticism, as opposed to essentially a belonging system or a belief system. That in Rohr's thinking, unless you've had some kind of inner experience, some kind of relationality connected, the tradition is barren. And yet for many, and we don't want to judge people, but there's a considerable number of people who claim to be Christian where the inner experience seems to have been somewhat eclipsed and not really out there front and center. And what Rohr wants us to do is to put that right out front and center, that that's really what it's all about. And that the mechanisms, the institutional mechanisms, are there to name and to celebrate and to sponsor that inner experience, if you will, and to prosper that inner experience, to celebrate that inner experience. At its best, that's what a good parish does. That's what a good institutional church does. A good congregation is celebrating, but it's not replacing the relationality and the inner experience, or what Rohr would call seeing as the mystics see. So, Christianity is a spiritual path. And I started talking, I wrote a book back in the 90s called Reconstructing Catholicism for a New Generation. And in that book, I really talk about Catholicism as an experience, primarily as an experience. That it's not, as many people think of it, mostly a rule book. I taught undergraduates at DePaul University in Chicago for quite a while. And I was opening day and I was dealing with students and asking them, you know, what is their background and so forth. And so this one girl says, "Oh, I know everything. I know all about Catholicism." The first thing I thought was, well, why are you taking the course? And she says, "I know all the rules." And I said, well, this is not about rules. That's not what this course is about. So the idea that we need to understand the tradition in terms of this relationality and this connectedness, and ultimately this oneness, this unity. Friday we talked about how we had learned that Jesus was only God and that we were merely human. But the deeper truth is that Jesus is the union of the divine and the human, and that's exactly what he calls us to become. We're called to our oneness with God in Christ and the Holy Spirit. So we talked about how this was the tradition in its earliest centuries, in the scriptures and the Greek fathers, and that today we're trying to retrieve that, trying to retrieve what was lost. And basically it's this focus on union with God and Christ and the Holy Spirit. So mysticism is experiential knowledge of God. One of the things I talked a little bit about Friday night was how our encounter with reality and our lived experience is also a theophany. Not everybody names it that. But naming it is not the key. The key is that the experience, in our encounter with reality, we have persistently an encounter with absolute mystery and its self-gift to us, with the graciousness and the buoyancy and the benevolence of the universe. I love to hear people tell their stories of providence. I've got great providence stories that if I told you, you'd say, oh, that didn't really happen. And I'd say, yes, it did. I couldn't make it up, thank you. But not just me, everybody in this room has providence stories. Where'd you meet your spouse? How'd you meet your spouse? You know, how did you wind up with the most important things in your life? You know, these are providential stories. So our encounter with life is also a theophany. We talked last time about how Evelyn Underhill describes mysticism as a process in which the individual soul moves towards final and utterly ineffable union with the Absolute, and that as she studied the great mystics, these were the patterns that were consistently present there. Okay? Awakening, purgation, illumination, the dark night of the soul, and finally union. I mentioned very briefly then that Rohr takes these same these same stages and says, this is going on in every human life. If we're alert, if we're awake, and if we don't kill it. You know? If fear doesn't win the day. And if we live life with a certain amount of openness and courageousness and so forth, these are the stages. And this is the journey from the false self to the true self. This is the Holy Spirit. No. Sorry about that. So these stages are in a way what we're going to be talking about tonight when we talk about Rohr talking about finding the true self, you know, moving beyond the false self. So, where's my IT guy?
That's a good question.
I guess I am.
So can I get to tonight's slides then? That would be great. So tonight what I'm going to do is to talk about Rohr's reflections on finding the true self. And by the way, most of you or many of you probably know that, you know, Thomas Merton used the same language. If you read Seeds of Contemplation, New Seeds of Contemplation, he explains a great deal there about discovering your true self. So, again, Rohr is obviously a great reflector on his own experience and a great student and scholar himself, but he's also being shaped and influenced by a lot of other folks. And in this case, the key person there is, in fact, Thomas Merton. Okay, so Rohr says this, that there is a self that needs to be found and a self that needs to be renounced. He's picking up the language from the Gospels about if you want to save yourself, if you want to save your life, if you want to lose, if you're going to save your life, you have to lose your life. But also the idea, if you want to follow me, you have to leave something behind. You have to renounce something. Every yes implies a prior to no. So there's a false self, which is the small self or the ego in Rohr's perspective, and the true self, which is what we would call our soul. So the soul and the ego are ways that we might talk about this false self and this true self. He says that finding the true self, when you find the true self, you have found an absolute reference point that is utterly within you and at the same time utterly beyond you. So you know it. This is me. This is really me. And yet you also know that this is way beyond the me I thought I was. This discovery of your true self, he says, feels like 1,000 pounds of weight have fallen from your back. You no longer need to build, protect, or promote any idealized self-image. It's the work of cultivating, which is the work of cultivating the false self. Building, projecting, promoting, and this idealized. And of course, one of the keys to that is, in fact, relationships of intimacy. when we begin, now, here's some water. When we begin a friendship or love relationship, it's usually two idealized selves sort of encountering one another. And that's the game of love. Sort of, you know, trying to live up to what the other person thinks I am and being sure that I don't expose anything else than that. Of course, I'm exactly the idealized self you thought I was. And projecting onto the other that same idealized self and making her live up to that as well. That's how a relationship begins. And if it never goes beyond that, or obviously it can't, if it's going to grow into an intimacy, those idealized selves are going to fall away. And ultimately, you're going to find in that relationship the safe space to be who you truly are. And so, in a deep and profound relationship of intimacy, where you're giving yourself away, you're becoming more truly who you are. More truly who you are. And so is the other. And you're growing in that way. So part of this encounter with reality, and by the way, it's not the only one. Deep, intimate, profound personal relationships are key, but they're not the only thing. This is happening in many, many dimensions of our life, including what we might call our professional life or our creativity, our capacity to know and understand and to think. Those are other places where this is going on. So, doesn't seem to be working.
You need to point it to the right machine.
To the computer.
That's okay.
Oh, there it goes.
So this is the title of Rohr's wonderful book. How many people have had a chance to look at this book or read it? So a good chunk of the audience, I highly, highly recommend it. Its subtitle is The Spirituality for the Second Half of Life. Of course, the second half of life, you know, depends on how old you're going to be. So he talks about the first half task as being to establish our security, our identity, our boundaries, our safety, a minimum of order. It's basically creating and nurturing an identity. One of the questions was Friday night was about somebody's 15-year-old son, and should we try to get them into the mystical consciousness? And I said, no. They're busy building their identity, their ego. It's very important. This is the essential task in the early part of life. Creating our boundaries, beginning to establish our ego, if you will. But there's side effects, and the side effects include what is called a manifestation of adolescent energy, either-or categories, and the tendency to rush towards judgment. I know none of you, certainly I never experienced any of those things. Or the fallout being dualistic thinking and the expanding circles of anger, hatred, and violence. So as we establish this identity and this over-againstness, we gradually move into an either-or consciousness, a dual consciousness, and in fact, it's very much a situation of anger, of hatred, and even violence. And so Rohr says, well, what we need is a ritual of closure from this stunted first energy. And in his work with male spirituality, this is called discharging your loyal soldier. So it's an actual ritual event in which you acknowledge that false self and say, bye-bye, thank you. Although it may feel like a loss of self, what is really going on is the death of the false self. And Rohr would say what's really going on here is the quiet workings of grace. In the second half of life, what happens? Well, we recognize our limits. Absolutely had none when I was 20. Or at least none that I was willing to admit or own, or maybe was even aware of. But recognizing your limits, accepting the tragic sense of life, dealing with necessary suffering, doing shadow work, leaving our comfort zone, and venturing out into the unknown, living now with a both-and perspective. This is the work, this is the growth towards the true self. And what Rohr says is what it's all about changes. You know, if you want to know what people profoundly value, it usually begins by people saying, well, this is what it's all about. I think it was Eleanor Roosevelt said, I can tell you what your values are if you show me your checkbook. But what's it all about? What's it really all about? It changes. And again, when we talk about first half of life, second half of life, we're not really talking in terms of absolute years or decades. Some people move into the second half of life early in life, and others of us remain in the first part of life until we're quite a ways along our path. But the focus shifts subtly but radically from me to the mystery of life. Rohr has 1,000 great stories about narcissism in young people and how it's really all about me, it's all about me, it's all about me. I like this, I love this, I hate this, I hate that. He was talking about being on an airplane with 3 teenage girls behind him, and he heard this. And finally he got up and said, nobody cares what you love or hate. That was an 8-hour flight, by the way. I think he bit his tongue for about 5.5 hours. But as a young person, it is all about me. And there's something appropriate about that. But if you're still talking that way, as you get into midlife and as you get into your older years, it's like, hey, wait a second. You begin to see that, no, it's not about you. It's about this larger reality, the mystery of life, or what we would call God. It's really all about God. And you're there to serve that, not the other way around. And of course, your idea of God changes too, doesn't it? First part, God's supposed to take care of me. And the second part is clearly I'm there to serve God. Now it's about being a generative person, seeing our life as more participative than assertive, living simply and radiating joy. So when older people begin to really get it together, their generativity, their participation, their simplicity, their joyfulness begins to expand and show itself. And it's more obvious to everybody who knows them. But it doesn't come without a struggle, without pain, without doubt, without sadness, without loneliness, without failure and loss. And it doesn't happen overnight. So it's not like one day you're here and then another day you're over here. You have to go through a pattern of loss and suffering. Mostly we would like to avoid that, ignore it, or simply deny it. Ignatian spirituality talks about discerning what really makes you happy and what poses as happiness. A lot of times the things that you think, oh, this is really what it's all, this is really what makes me happy. And then as you get older, you realize, you know, that's not really doing it. That's not what really makes me happy. In the second half of life, we let go and let God. We experience detachment and discover the true self. Now, some people experience much of what I'm talking about precisely in 12-step groups. 12-step groups is where the death of their idealized self and the birth of their true self begins to emerge, and their spirituality is grounded in all that. That's key to their, Rohr has a wonderful book called Breathing Underwater, in which he talks precisely about all of this spirituality in terms of 12-step groups. Okay, so then what happens, oh, I'm sorry. So those are the slides I've been talking about. Finding the fullness of life. The common wisdom tells us that the second half of life is largely about getting old, dealing with health issues, and letting go of our physical life. But Rohr's perspective is exactly the opposite. What looks like falling can in fact be experienced as falling upward and onward into a broader and deeper world where the soul has found its fullness and is finally connected to the whole and lives inside the big picture. Your time for all of this skirmishing and competing and struggling are over, and your time to be present and affirmative and connected and real emerges. Now, Richard is very clear. The false self is not a bad self. Self that God does not like and we should not like. False self is quite good and necessary as far as it goes. It just doesn't go far enough. And it often poses and thus substitutes for the real thing. So a lot of times, the false self, from our perspective, is the real self. What are you talking about? That's me. And recognizing that, no, that's an idealized self that we've constructed, and it's not really our true self, that's the challenge, that's the struggle. He says the false self is more bogus than bad, and bogus only when it pretends to be more than it truly is. In a false self world, there is nothing but fashion and display. It's all about image, and yet people believe it, and they buy it. So he talks about how the false self is our starting point in spirituality. Okay? A lot of times, we spend so much energy and time and effort catechizing the very young, religious education for children. I would say that in the church that I grew up, socializing young people into the church was the major apostolic activity. That's really what they did. The pastoral life of the church was socializing young people. And yet, it's clear that today, that's not what it's all about. It's all about helping adults in this process that we're talking about right here. And if adults get this, then the education of young people becomes much more natural and effective, because young people begin to see, oh, Mom and Dad really believe this. It's really been, it really is transformative in them. So the false self is the starting point. It's who we think we are, but our thinking doesn't make it true. And it's mostly, and this is a beautiful way of putting it, I think, mostly a social contract to get us started on our life journey. A set of agreements between our childhood, our parents, our family, our neighbors, our school, our partner, our spouse, and our religion. That's what makes up our false self. Jung might say it's really all about the self that emerges primarily from our fears and desires. What we're most afraid of and what we're most desirous of, that is what ultimately shapes the false self. We begin our life with mostly only an awareness of our false self, but spiritual maturity eventually leads us to recognize that this is not who we truly are. And I would say spiritual maturity grows out of life experience. And here are the 4 illusions that can stunt our growth. It says that there's 4 illusions that make any experience of God or our true selves largely impossible. 4 major splits from reality. Okay, remember last time we were talking about how God is reality, and connecting with reality is in fact connecting with God. 4 major splits from reality that we have made to create our false self. The first is a split from our shadow self and our pretension to simply be our idealized self. We split our mind from our body and soul and live in our minds. Men are better at this than women. Living only in our minds, I think. Women naturally are more connected to their body, their emotions, their soul. We split life from death and try to live our life without any death or without any awareness of mortality. And we split ourselves from other selves and try to live apart, superior, separate. And so following through with true intimacy is something we back away from. Holding on to these illusions and practicing diversionary tactics keeps us preoccupied with our false selves. So even though life drives us towards discovering our true self and owning it, there's a lot in us also that fights against it. And you could talk about this as sin and grace if you want to, that language. The key here, and as far as tonight's presentation is concerned, is all about noticing, watching what's going on. So we're really talking tonight about the contemplative process of noticing our life. That's what Buddhism is all about. That's, by the way, what Ignatian spirituality is all about. Noticing. St. Ignatius Loyola, the spiritual exercises, are all about paying attention to your own experience, watching it. Spirituality is basically overcoming those 4 splits, overcoming our illusions and facing reality, and finding truth, peace, happiness, and love. In the Christian tradition, following Christ and becoming Christ is the pattern of the true self. And this is not first a matter of morality, but of spirituality. What a great point. Because most of us are always asking the question, what should we do? We were taught that. Morality was what it was all about. What should we be doing? And this spirituality says at its center, nothing. Don't just do something, sit there. Because it's God's work. And part of achieving all of this and accomplishing all this is part of the work of our idealized self, our false self, that we're in charge. And stopping and letting go and letting God is the great challenge of this process. The key to all this is paying attention, noticing, letting go, and letting God, or what we call contemplation. And in the process, Rohr says, illusion fades and the true self emerges. Pardon? Gradually, honesty insists itself. We can hide in honesty in 1,000 different ways. And certainly, the person who suffers from substance abuse tries every one of them. But so do the rest of us in many ways. We all try the ways to avoid that honest look at our true self. But ultimately, honesty insists itself when we come to ourselves, as the scriptures say. Gradually and subtly, there is a transformation. And the true self knows that my life is not about me, but I am about life. We don't create our true self or earn it or work up to it in any moral or ritual behavior whatsoever. So this idea of finding your true self doesn't have a blueprint that you can go out and say, okay, I'm on my way now. I'm going to go find my true self. Rather, he says, it is all and forever mercy for all of us and all the time, and there are no exceptions. We do not climb up to our true self. We fall into it. Well, this is the work of God. The work of God in the fabric of our life as we deal with reality. The true self watches our ego and knows the difference. The discovery of your true self is also the discovery of God. So, when we discover our true self, we also simultaneously discover the true God, or perhaps better, God finds us, and we see who we really are. It's a better way. Again, we tend to think of this always as, what are we doing? How do we find God? How do we find our true self? Rather than letting God find us. And stop running 1,000 miles an hour the other way. Stop trying so hard. St. Catherine of Genoa put it this way, my deepest self is God. Goes back to what we were talking about Friday night. The true self is the treasure hidden in the field, and the pearl of great price in the Gospels. It's worth everything that you might have. Gospel language is so clear. Why would you do all of this and all of that and lose your soul? And yet, we often are moving precisely in that path. Our core anxiety that we are not good enough is resolved from the beginning. And we can stop all our climbing, our contending, our criticizing, and our competing. And what happens is that we begin to discover our union with God. And this is the experience of our primal union with God, who is our source and our destiny. Our soul is who we are in God and who God is in us. We can never lose our true self, but we can fail to realize it. Our soul is our very essence, our exact thisness, and it will never happen again in another incarnation. We begin...
Really? It'll never happen again.
It will never happen again in another incarnation. Are you a reincarnation person?
Well, I've been wondering about that a lot, and it just really struck me when you said that. Do we carry some bits and pieces of that with us?
Not according to Rohr. Okay? According to Rohr, we have this one shot. And it's in this one shot where we find our union with God, or we don't.
Do we?
And our union with God is all about what we're talking about, letting go and falling into God, and letting God find us. Okay? He says we begin with divine DNA. That's our inner destiny. That's our absolute core that knows the truth about us. That is the Imago Dei. It's there in every one of us. So inside your true self, you know that you are not alone. And you foundationally belong to God and to the universe. One woman put it to me this way. She said, you know, when I was in my late 20s and early 30s, I always knew, I always had this sense from when I was a little girl that somebody loved me profoundly, as I really am. But until I went through a conversion process, I never knew that there was anyone really there. It's kind of like Cyrano and Roxanne. Never knew that I was truly loved. I think all of us know something about that. It's the Holy Spirit poured into your heart, and it has been given to you. So this is there from the beginning. This is who we are. And yet, we don't realize this without some serious spiritual work, which is mainly letting go and not actually achieving. Letting go of illusion and finding the true self. So this is where we begin the Four Noble Truths of tonight's talk, because I want to talk about this in dialogue with Buddhism. Because I think the great spiritual teacher, Siddhartha Gautama, the Buddha, the one who woke up, the enlightened one, has so much to teach us about this. And so did Merton. And the parallels are this, that we need to let go of illusion and find the true self. This has a deep resonance with the process of enlightenment in Buddhism, and as I mentioned, with Ignatius Loyola. Gautama's journey towards spiritual enlightenment is called waking up. The Buddha is the one who woke up. In his youth, his father fostered illusion, hiding pain and suffering from his son and trying to satiate him with every sensual pleasure. But the process goes from illusion to renunciation and then finally to enlightenment. If you take those 5 stages of mysticism, you can move them into these 3: illusion, renunciation, enlightenment. Eventually, the young Gautama encounters 4 signs: an old man walking, a man afflicted with illness, a dead man being carried, and a homeless, wandering ascetic. That's not what he knew as a young man on the walls of his father's palace. But when he ventures outside the palace, he discovers basically the patterns of suffering and mortality and death that are all a part of every life. And his encounter with suffering led him into a path of renunciation, living a life of radical asceticism in the forest. And that's where we use all of our energy. But that direction eventually ran its course, and he was finally able to let it go. He bathed, he ate, he slept, he woke up under the Bodhi tree, no longer under the heat of craving, but at peace in the present moment. So that's the story of the Buddha. Many of you, I'm sure, are familiar with it. If you're not, I would encourage you to get familiar with it. PBS has a great video on the Buddha's life. What was the name of that? Anybody remember? Just called the Buddha. So, his spiritual journey yields what he calls the Four Noble Truths. And these are the Four Noble Truths. There is suffering. The word here is dukkha. We'll talk a little bit about that. The second is the origin of suffering. Where does suffering come from? Thirdly, the cessation of suffering. That suffering can cease. And fourthly, the Eightfold Path that leads to the cessation of dukkha. So, let's start with the first, the truth of suffering. And this noble truth really means that suffering is physical, it's mental, it's spiritual, and that in our own lived existence, it is the fact that we are mortal, that our existence is fragile, that we all know illness and injury, aging and death, that we are anxious and dissatisfied, and we're never really content, at least not for more than a passing moment. You know, I tell the story about Phil Jackson, the basketball coach who coached the Bulls for a long time before he went to California and coached the Lakers. And he wrote a book called Sacred Hoops. In that book he talks about how as a young man he was a crazy athlete. He played all the sports. That's all he did was practice and work out and play sports. And he always wanted to achieve. And finally he focused on basketball. And finally he was able ultimately to get to the NBA and to play for the Knicks. And they worked very hard and they worked very hard. And then eventually they won the NBA title. And he had achieved this lifetime goal. And the next day he said, "Is that it?" He wasn't really satisfied. He wasn't really satisfied. I think that's the way of success for so many people. If I can just get that degree, if I can just get that book, if I can just meet that right person, we can only have kids. They can never really leave home. But the idea that we always have something more out there. And when we get to the thing that we most wanted all of our life, and we're still not really satisfied. That's what this truth is telling us about. That there's an anxiety and a dissatisfaction, a dis-ease that is at the center of our existence. And that we're never really happy for more than a passing moment. And we experience the stress of trying to hold on in a world of persistent and continuous change. We're insecure. Unanswered questions about origins and destiny and identity and purpose. So this noble truth of the Buddha, the fact that there is suffering, includes all of these. Physical, illness, injury, suffering, our mortality, but also our anxiety, our dissatisfaction, the stress that we experience and our insecurity. All of that is at the core of our existence from the Buddha's insight that there is suffering. It's very clear, it's very precise. Acknowledgement that at this time there is some feeling of unhappiness. It can range from anguish, despair, to mild irritation. But dukkha does not necessarily mean a catalog of crises and ailments. So people will say, well, I don't know what you're talking about. My life isn't all about suffering. Yes, it is. It may not be a catalog of crises and ailments, but this deeper, more profound disease and anxiety is with all of us all the time. It doesn't necessarily mean severe suffering. It means we are always being exposed to pleasure and pain and their dualisms, and life is not perfect or ideal or the way it should be. I have a friend who was a visiting professor at the University of San Diego, and he went out there and he said, wow, It's the most beautiful campus I've ever seen. The Pacific is out there. It's a gorgeous campus. And he was sitting out there surrounded by fountains and flowers and taking a break. And the people in this department that he was visiting were out there bickering and complaining. And he thought to himself, why are you complaining? You're in paradise. Okay? So it goes on that way. Well, the second noble truth is, what is the origin of suffering? Where does dukkha come from? And what the Buddha discovered is that it's not just the little things themselves, it's something deeper beyond that, what he calls tanha, or thirst, or craving, and ignorance. A better way of talking about this is our grasping. We're always grasping, okay? Desire doesn't cause suffering, but the cause of suffering is the grasping of desire. This thirst, the great word for it is a thirst or a craving. Always want more, something beyond. Knowing the difference between what is natural and necessary for survival and what is not necessary survival is key to this whole process. Obviously, we need nourishment, we need sleep, etc., etc. But that isn't the source of our craving, the source of our grasping. Our disease and anxiety emerge from our attachment to what we desire beyond what is necessary. And that's not just meaning we want to accumulate a lot of things, although in our culture that's certainly a part of it. But it's much more about our reputation, about how we're perceived by others, etc. There's 1,000 ways that we crave what is not necessary. The ignorance is that we're deluded by grasping. Grasping means being deluded by our desires, thinking it's really me and mine. These desires are me, and there is something wrong with me for having them, or I don't like the way I am now, I have to become something else, or I have to get rid of something before I can become what I want to be. But all of this is desire. So all of this drives our craving. You see? It's not just material desires, it's psychological desires, and it's even spiritual desires. The great Rinpoche Trungpa wrote a book called Cutting Through Spiritual Materialism, and how we can move this grasping and this craving that is at the core of who we are in every direction that we can. So we listen to it with bare attention, not saying it's good or bad, but merely recognizing it for what it is. So the cessation of dukkha is possible. Okay? Dukkha is the reality of suffering. Where does that come from? What is its origin? It comes from this grasping or this craving. So how does it cease? When we see clearly the truth of suffering and understand its source as this deep hunger and thirst, that makes us crave and grasp for what is beyond necessity and survival. That's what's going on. Then the cessation of this is possible via the cessation of craving and grasping. So if you're going to get rid of suffering, you have to go to this core of craving and grasping. And by the way, this is what's going on as we mature and grow in our encounter with life in Roar's focus on discovering the true self. We recognize our cravings and our graspings, and we don't act on them, we simply notice them. Okay? Is this making sense? We recognize them, but we don't act on them. I want a cigarette. I really want a cigarette. But I'm not going to have a cigarette. I recognize my craving, says the smoker. So it's not about willpower, but a very gentle and subtle recognizing of awareness and letting go. So you're not going to stop smoking, you're not going to stop drinking, you're not going to stop drugs, you're not going to stop feeding your idealized self and protecting it and continuing to project it unless you begin to recognize this source. Okay? And it's not about willpower, it's about noticing. Detachment by allowing all things to arise. Before we can let things go, we have to admit them into full consciousness. And this is what I mean when I talked about how honesty ultimately wins out. We have to admit it into our full consciousness. This is really real. This is really me. This is really happening. The aim is to skillfully allow the subconscious to arise into consciousness, and this is in the process of contemplation. All the despairs, all the fears, all the anguish, all the suppression, and the anger is allowed to become conscious. This happens. This happens. We might notice that we become very disappointed in ourselves because we feel we are not as good as we should have been. I could have been a contender. I could have accomplished all this. We become disappointed in this false self. We think we should not feel angry or jealous. All the shoulds and the shouldn'ts arise and take our consciousness. And then we create desire to get rid of the bad things. And this desire has a righteous quality. It seems right to get rid of bad thoughts, anger, and jealousy because a good person should not be like that. And so we feel guilty because we're not the good person we should be. You see how this cycle grows? So, the Four Noble Truths about suffering, about its source, about its cessation, are ultimately what lead to the Eightfold Path of the Buddha. Right understanding, right aspiration, speech, action, livelihood, effort, mindfulness, and concentration. It's really focused primarily on this process of noticing, of paying attention to our experience, rather than fleeing from it in 1,000 escapes. Listening to what's really going on, what's really happening, and paying attention to ourselves. And what do we really want? What will really make us happy? And what do we think we need, but we don't really need? So this process in Buddhism centers around primarily about meditation. And it's about moving away from ignorance. The ignorance that drives us continually in the same old way that makes us unhappy. I was talking to someone who's an alcoholic not too long ago, and she was telling me how hard it is to quit. You don't understand, it's so hard to quit. And I said, the only thing that's harder than quitting. And she said, what? I said, not quitting. Unless you can come to that yourself, unless you can come to recognize that not feeding those four illusions that Roy talked about is actually more problematic than accepting your shadow side, than accepting your vulnerability and the reality of death. and all of the other sides of those. Okay, so what is Rohr saying through all this? He's saying that life teaches us the path of discipleship. Life teaches us the path of discipleship. The Christian faith leads us as we mature in a similar pattern to these Four Noble Truths. A subtle detachment, selling all that you have and giving it to the poor. Discovering a treasure hidden in a field. The treasure finds us. You ever remember how that story works? It's almost as though the treasure finds the person. How do you find the treasure in a field? There's no blueprint for that. There's no moral way to go find that. The treasure finds you. Openness to gracious mystery, gratitude and joy, and yielding to intimacy and community, living simply the life of compassion and service. Well, you might say, well, these are the Four Noble Truths of Christianity. The subtle detachment, the discovering the treasure, the openness to gracious mystery, the yielding to intimacy and communion. This is falling upward. This is what happens in adult spirituality, or in spirituality in the second half of life. Or another way of putting the Four Noble Truths for Christians is this way. We are loved unconditionally from the beginning and called to intimacy with God and all creation. That's our DNA. That's our imago Dei. That's what is given in the beginning. But in fear, we deny that love and flee its intimacy. We seek spirit substitutes. We try to establish our own place in the world, security and control. We build the false self. But one of us, Jesus of Nazareth, opened himself completely to that love and gave himself completely to that intimacy. That's the truth of redemption. And finally, we find our true self in him. If you want to know who you really are, we look to Christ. Not Jesus of Nazareth, who walked the dusty roads of Galilee in the 20s, but that pattern that is exhibited in his existence, in which he opened himself completely to God and accepted his true self as the Son of God. We find our true self in him and follow in his way, discipleship, walking in the Spirit, communion. That's the Four Noble Truths of Christian faith. So what have I said tonight? Well, I've said that there's a self we need to renounce and a self we need to find. The self we need to renounce is not a bad self. It's just not an adequate self. And ultimately, it becomes a bogus self. It becomes a substitute self. And if we hang on to it as we move into our mature years, we're missing the great opportunity to find our true self, or let God find us, if you will. And this is the path of mysticism. This is the path of maturity. It's the path of growth. And it's the deepest path of spirituality. Spirituality ultimately is not another kind of materialism. Sad to say, growing up Roman Catholic in the 50s, I thought I could accumulate grace and just keep gathering lots and lots of grace. Of course, one mortal sin and you lost it. But that was spiritual materialism. This idea of letting go and letting God, and of recognizing who we really are. This is why I urge all of us to connect with the poor. Because the poor know who they are more than the middle class knows who we are. We can pretend better. The poor are, it's right there. Look to the people who are suffering tonight. Same thing with people who are quite ill. People who are quite ill, they can't live up to that image. I don't want them to see me this way. But all of us are the suffering, all of us are the poor. To connect with those people and to recognize ourselves in them is to begin to recruit an openness to our true self. So this is, I think, one of the great teachings of Rohr. I hope I gave, I was up to it tonight for that. I'd love to discuss it with you. Thank you. So questions or comments? While you're thinking about your comments or questions, maybe some of you are familiar with this, but let me share with you some images called Jewish Buddhism. Now, hopefully a lot of you have had good friends who are Jewish and you begin to know Jewish people. This is what happens when Judaism meets Buddhism. If there is no self, whose arthritis is this? Be here now, be someplace else later. Is that so complicated? Wherever you go, there you are. Your luggage is another story. Accept misfortune as a blessing. Do not wish for perfect health or a life without problems. What would you have to talk about? There is no escaping karma. In a previous life, you never called, you never wrote, you never visited. Whose fault was that? Anyway, these are great. Questions or comments about finding your true self and what we've been talking about tonight?
Is there a microphone up here?
There should be a second.
I can say I've already lost myself. As I get into starting to get to be elderly, I'm 76, I've always thought and commented to myself that God is really a whole lot smarter than I am. Because as I lose the things I was before, I have a choice. And it seems to me the more I lose, the more I connect to God. And therefore, in a way, I'm giving up to gain something. God isn't stupid. Old age is there for a reason, I do believe.
Is this on? No, this is. But thanks for having me. I don't know how to do it.
On the bottom.
Here.
The bottom. Yeah.
Okay. So she's got a mic and I've got a mic. Comments or questions? Thoughts? Well, let's take a second. What did you get out of tonight's talk? Does this make sense in terms of your own experience? Did it sound crazy to you? Okay. Yes, sir.
I am currently reading Immortal Diamond, and my question is there any cause and effect between stripping away pieces of your false self and heading in the direction of the true self?
Okay, so he's reading Rohr's book, The Immortal Diamond, and the question is, say it again.
That's a challenge. Is there any cause and effect between stripping away the awareness and stripping away of component parts of your false self and heading in the direction of the true self?
Wow. So is there any cause and effect between stripping away the false self and heading in the direction of the true self? See, I think that the most profound problem with our false self is that we're in charge and that we're doing it. That we're going to strip away our false self, and it doesn't work that way. I think you're in that stage that the Buddha was in terms of that rigorous spirituality of going to the forest, you know. But ultimately, you have to let go of that. You have to let go. So is there a cause? Well, it's not a bad thing to try and strip away your false self. But ultimately, you have to let go of that effort itself. And recognize that this is the work of God and not your work. And, you know, it feels more comfortable when we can just do it ourselves. But when it's happening to us, it feels, that's the pain and the suffering of this process. So it's not something that we can do with our own moral energy and with our willpower, as I said. It has to be something that we let go. But go for it. It won't be the last step.
One morning in meditation, I asked God, why is there so much suffering in the world? And the response was, because if there wasn't suffering, nobody would ever turn to me. Because as long as we can do it, we're going to do it.
Well, I would like to push you to go a little further with your reflection. Not that that's wrong, but I think one of the major reasons why there's so much suffering in the world is because there's so much indifference on the part of... Most of the suffering in the world is caused by other human beings and is tolerated by other human beings. Now there's all the suffering that I was talking about in dukkha is there anyway. That will never go away. Illness, injury, death, separation, loss, anxiety. But there's so much suffering that we could eliminate. And so part of the reason that there's so much suffering in the world is because we don't love God enough. If we love the Lord our God with our whole heart and soul, then we would begin to love our neighbor as ourselves. And we would begin to see, you know, the nonsense of the isolated, autonomous self. So, you know, there is a polity in all this. There's a polity in all this. There's an editorial in the USA Today that said, closing the income gap, which has become more and more obvious, that there's this huge gap now between the wealthy and the middle class. Closing that gap is not necessary. In fact, growth requires that we grow it. Okay, that's one set of economics, but put on Yahweh's economics. Put on covenant spirituality, and you come up with something quite different. So I appreciate your comment, but I didn't want to leave it there because I think, yes, suffering does drive us to God, but human suffering can be eliminated. And the other suffering is enough to drive us to God.
Another question back here.
Okay?
Glenn Beck called me this morning, and he spoke with me at some length, and at the end of it, he asked me to send him $25. And since this is a good Catholic boy, I knew that this was the voice of God, and in seeking my true self, I did it. I'm having trouble analyzing that. Can you help me with that?
Well, the first thing I'd like to ask you is, what's your number? Who was this that you were talking to?
Glenn Beck.
Oh, Glenn Beck. Well, you made a big mistake.
How can I tell?
Huh?
How can I tell?
How can you tell that you made a big mistake?
Yes, this is the voice of God calling me on my cell phone, which is godly. How can I tell?
Well, first of all, you need to, check out your cell phone and be sure that this is where it was coming from. Because my guess is it wasn't coming from God. Okay, I think it was coming from Glenn Beck. No, translate your question a little for me, will you?
In seeking to align myself with the messages God sends me, sometimes I have trouble deciphering what messages are sound and what messages are unsound. It seems to me that that is a major struggle in moving from the false self to the true self.
Bingo.
And,
Okay.
Are we on?
I get it. Yeah. This is not always clear. So you're exactly right on target. And I think, in Jesuit spirituality, Ignatian spirituality, this is the work of discernment. Trying to discern. Because it's not always clear what is true self and what is false self. We've identified with the false self so long that we don't immediately recognize it as a false self at all. And that doesn't just change in a day. There is this process. And so, yeah, the work of discernment, this is why, again, it's important to, connect with other people who are serious about this. I encourage people to use spiritual direction, but that's not always available to everybody. But if it is, it's a good thing, because a good spiritual director can frequently be a real help in this process of discernment. But you're exactly right. These things are not always clear, and the direction that we should go is not easy. And part of it is being willing to back up and say that was definitely not the right way. We sometimes learn by trial and error, and some of the trial seemed like at first like it was truth, not error. Being willing to recognize it as error is a humiliation sometimes, depending on what it's all about. It might be a great humiliation. It's also something that's good for the soul. So, yes?
Here I come. I'm chronologically advanced.
Thank you. The Muslim world is on my mind almost constantly nowadays. And it's probably true of most of us in the room. So I'd like to ask a question that may be far afield and not totally fair for you. But what about Islam? Can a Muslim person following Islam find the true self? And does Islam offer Four Noble Truths?
Thank you. Muslim spirituality offers 5 pillars. And the 5 pillars of Islam are parallel in many ways to these 4 noble truths. Yes, absolutely. A Muslim spirituality will drive its subjects towards the same kind of union that we're talking about. When I was head of campus ministry, head of university ministry at DePaul, I was in charge of spirituality for all of the religious diversity of the university. So we had a Muslim prayer room, and the students would come. Muslim spirituality asked its adherents to pray 5 times a day, and to do so by touching their forehead to the ground. These students would come in very faithfully to their prayer, and I thought, well, gee, wouldn't it be great if we could get our Catholic students to pray just once a day, let alone 5 times a day. But beyond that, it was marvelous to see how they took care of each other and how they nurtured one another. They were tremendous. And then the great test came when the conflicts in the Middle East began to spill out into the university. And the Muslim students and the Hillel students sponsored programs together. It was incredible. So absolutely, Muslim spirituality, and by the way, Muhammad is also a mystic. Where did the Quran come from? The Quran is the experience of mysticism, of revelation and faith received, and it has to be understood as that. It's not supposed to be anything other than the record of Muhammad's own mystical experience. So, can it go way off? Yep. Can Christianity go way off? Yep. So Muslim spirituality, as I understand it, is a truly viable spirituality that can drive people towards discovering their true self and living out of that.
I find myself kind of on the cusp of that first half of life spirituality and the second half, and I find it really inconvenient. And it's real disruptive, and I guess that kind of what the comment to it is, I appreciate having some constructs and language to put around naming the process. What's difficult about it, I guess, is having to live and function in the world while you're going through this incredible, metamorphosis, if you will. And the pressures, what's interesting is the pressures around us kind of demand that we function or perform in that first half, and you can take care of the second half stuff on coffee break.
Thank you. Absolutely. And so, how can you deal with all of that when you're trying to live professional life and sort of keep up appearances, as you say? Yeah, absolutely.
There's one in the back
I
room.
understood you to say that to experience the fullness of life, the key is noticing. Can you comment about whether Rohr suggests a method of noticing or how we can develop that ability?
Absolutely. He's talking about contemplation. Contemplation is the way of noticing. And if you pick up The Naked Now, there's a whole bunch of exercises in the back of that actually nurture that. I mean, Thomas Keating has books on this. There's lots of how-tos in terms of contemplative prayer that are out there And that's exactly what Rohr is recommending. So he has his own exercises. I know in the Naked Now, but he might, does anybody happen to know in terms of falling upward, does he have any kinds of appendices there? In a number of his books, he has appendices specifically focused on that kind of practice. So contemplative practice is key. One of the things I wanted to talk about a little bit tonight was about silence, because one of the great contemplative practices is silence. And it's at the heart of contemplative practice in terms of prayer, is trying to move beyond our interpreting reality with words. Words skew reality. Silence will not allow us to skew reality with words. So Rohr's got I'm not sure where his essay on this is. Does anybody happen to know offhand where his essay on silence is? Okay, so, but we could spend a lot of time talking about it, but the whole idea of contemplation is not just to be quiet with your mouth and to have a lot of words going on in your head, but to stop the words in here. Okay? If you stop the words in here, then what you notice is reality. See? That's a whole nother lecture. Joachim.
I liked the words and the idea that the pastor brought up about you're supposed to do this noticing during your coffee break. My trouble when I read these books on meditation coming out of a Western tradition, I get the impression that you're only noticing, you're only doing this when you're in meditation. Whereas I got the impression from your Friday night talk that all of this is going on in your daily life all the time. It's not. So I get the impression almost consistently from spiritual books that you do this in meditation, but it sounds like that's all, you know, they don't seem to give justice to when you're the rest of your life.
Yeah, well, I think my experience has been quite the opposite. That practicing, contemplative practice feeds my awareness in life. That my awareness in life feeds my capacity for contemplation. That's not exactly the way my experience has gone. Okay? I think shutting up and being quiet and trying to notice, paying attention in meditation leads you to that in terms of how you are in a million other settings, including on the subway in Chicago. Seriously. So, but you're absolutely right. If it's not doing that, if contemplation is just this, oh, I've got to spend my 15 minutes, or I've got to do my half-hour of meditation, but it's not feeding your encounter with life, there's absolutely no point in it, from my perspective.
Can I clarify that, Bob? What I wasn't referring to the amount of time in the coffee break, I just meant, please don't inconvenience us while you're going through this metamorphosis, you know what I'm saying? And what I would say, pastorally speaking, is can you just take care of that on Saturday, and please don't bring it into the pulpit because it really messes me up.
My experience, though, again, with pastors, is the more they're willing to bare their soul in terms of some of this, wow, so much more effective they are in their preaching and their connecting with people. But it's risky. All of this is risky business. And fear is one of the things that keeps us from moving more in this direction. Now I have some great insights here from our neuroscience professor here, who tells me that amygdala is the operating system for the fear circuit in the brain. Okay? And that when we were Friday night, we were talking about oxytocin. This has got to shut down before oxytocin kicks in. So that bonding, fear and bonding in a certain sense are opposite, just in terms of the operations of the brain. Just in terms of the operation of the brain. We have to deal with fear. And, you know, one person put it to me this way, is that whatever we're afraid of is not as bad as the fear that we hang on to. So imagine the worst thing in the world, and that isn't as bad as the crippling effect that fear has on our life. If there's one thing in Christian spirituality, there's one thing that Jesus came to overcome, to help us overcome, it is fear. And that's the whole fundamental teaching of the resurrection. We have nothing to fear. Not even that. You know? Not even the suffering and humiliation of public crucifixion. We don't have to be afraid. So I like what you're saying, and this is a very important point, because I think this is, you know, those of us that, and all of us to some extent, try to keep up appearances. A lot of times our friends won't let us find our true self. You know? I liked your old self. Come on. A lot of times, maybe our spouse doesn't want to let us find our true self. Or maybe we don't want to let our spouse find her true self. I mean, it does take a certain amount of community support to move through this. That's one of the great things about the 12-step groups, is that you have that community support built right in. Yes, let go of your alcoholic self and become your what's the other, it's not
Sober self.
sober self, but it's your, no. Question. Recovering self, your recovering self. Please.
I appreciate your teaching so much tonight, and I've studied the Four Noble Truths a little bit, and lately it seems like everything I've been reading, all the authors, all the teachings from different paths have been pretty much saying the same thing about surrendering and letting go and not grasping, not resisting. Recently I was reading a more contemporary author. He was talking about the value of building community by emptying yourself, releasing all your judgments and opinions. And I'd love to hear you, Dr. Ludwig, say, point us to a few more scripture, a few more Christ teachings that correlate with this. I mean, I think of the lilies of the field, toiling not kind of teaching. Can you give us a little more scripture reference that correlates with this?
Sure, I'd be happy to. If you take the Synoptic Gospels and the teachings of Jesus in Mark, Matthew, Luke, and John, there's a distinction between the broad path and the narrow path. The broad path is your false self. The narrow path is your true self. There's nothing wrong with the false self. The broad path is not out there raping, pillaging, and murdering. So look how Jesus is saying, you've heard this, but I'm saying this. The broad path, and by the way, if you want to read an excellent commentary on this, Marcus Borg's book on Jesus, where he talks about the teachings of Jesus and the narrow path, really lays this out beautifully. It's excellent. So, Jesus is continually calling his contemporaries to their true self. You know, I think it's Hebrews that says, you know, Scripture is like a two-edged sword, cutting to the very marrow. See, Jesus is cutting through all the BS that he's being presented by this group, by that group, and another group, and by the way, by us. And he's saying, he's helping us realize that it's fear that keeps us there. And he's saying, you don't have to be afraid. You don't have to be afraid. So the teachings of Jesus are loaded. The Gospels are loaded with Jesus calling people to their true identity, their true self. You've heard this said, but I say this to you. Each time he's saying that, it's about renouncing the broad path and what is the narrow path? The narrow path is the path of the Son. It's also the path of the sons and daughters. It's your path, it's my path, if we're willing to go in that direction. It's really profoundly there.
Yeah.
Thanks for asking the question. Yes?
I deeply appreciated one of the answers or responses you gave to the question where you talked about it's about loving God with your whole heart and mind and strength and whatever. Because, and then being able to love yourself. My experience of centering prayer in some of the teaching has been so profound that if I'm just practicing God's presence or consenting to it or saying yes to God or whatever way I approach that, then whatever thoughts come, that's practicing letting them go. And that has made such a huge difference in the rest of my day and my life when things come. And I have a tool. I practiced it, it's there, but more importantly, it's when those thoughts come, where are they coming? They're coming into the presence of God, which is within me. That is huge. That goes against every cultural thing about God being out there and all the prayers, oh, we hope that your presence is here today. Please send your spirit. I mean, it's so radically different.
Thank you for sharing that. And of course, good spiritual practice is not an automatic recipe for what you're talking about, but it puts us in the mood for yielding. It begins to open us up and to listen, to pay attention. And if we're listening and pay attention, we can't miss it. We can't miss it. So, thank you. Yes. What happened to Ruth?
Here I am. I'm making my way.
There's somebody over here.
There's somebody here too.
Okay, go ahead.
I just wondered what Rohr would say about the uniqueness of Christ. Because I think on Friday you mentioned, you had something that you said about the uniqueness of Christ. But, you know, I think a lot of Buddhists would say that, yes, the path to enlightenment is there in Christianity, but Christians make this mistake of thinking that Christ was the only Son of God, the unique Son of God, who followed this path. And so I'm just wondering what Rohr would say about that.
Yeah, well, what Rohr would say about that, were you here on Friday night? Oh, okay. I thought I made that clear. What Rohr would say about that is, the heart of what Jesus is saying is, come follow me, do what I'm doing, become who I am. I mean, the Christian is called to become Christ in the world. Okay? Not to just practice Jesusolatry. Okay? We're called to be the presence of Christ in the world. We're called to be other Christs. Not by trying to be Jesus of Nazareth, but by being truly who we are. By being our true self. So you can look at Jesus' temptations. The temptations of Christ in the desert are all an appeal to be your false self. And in each case, he turns it down. See? So, Am I responding to your question or not?
I just mean,
What is the uniqueness of Christ?
yeah, in terms
The uniqueness of Christ is that he got it. He really got it. And God really got him. And that's a pattern for those of us who follow after it. But the idea that Jesus is some other kind of being, that's the problem. That he's some other kind of being. That, you know, there were two early heresies which we never heard about. One was called Monophysitism, and the other was called Docetism. And in each case, they denied the humanity of Jesus. Most of Christianity denies the humanity of Jesus. Try to talk to anybody about the humanity of Jesus and they think you're a heretic. Okay? Then try to talk to anybody about the divinity of human beings and they think you're a heretic. But Rohr courageously proclaims both of those. That Jesus is not only God, he's the union of God and the human, and we are not merely human, we are to become the sons and daughters of God, and to realize that same identity. Am I speaking to your question now?
yes.
Okay. Thank you. Yes?
What can you say to a person who believes that suffering is an unmitigated evil and that God permits it, so how can he be a just and loving God?
That's an easy one. Well, you know, there's different ways. I wrote a whole essay about this not too long ago. It's easy to talk about, it's easier to talk about other people, the other people's suffering than our own, you know. But suffering is not a good to be nurtured. We don't want to say, I had an aunt whose spirituality was that. You know, she loved suffering and she thought that, you know, that was the only way to holiness was the more you could, was a kind of masochism, you know. But I think suffering is an inevitable part of life, okay? In all the ways that we were talking about it when we were talking about dukkha, it isn't an unmitigated evil, though. In Rohr's teaching, it is a source of our transformation. And so, rather than resisting it and denying it, to work through it, you know, adversity will either kill you or it'll change you. Suffering will either kill you or it will change you. And all of us have some pretty heavy doses of suffering in our lives, you know? If we can work with that, it will transform us. In terms of God, I don't believe in that kind of puppeteer God that's up there pulling strings and saying, well, I think we'll throw down some suffering on George now. But I think if God is reality, then suffering in our encounter with reality is a part of all that. I mean, she made a wonderful comment there earlier, and I hope you didn't feel like I was putting your comment down, because you did feel like I was putting. Well, I wasn't putting your comment down. I just was trying to expand it by saying that a lot of suffering is caused by other human beings and our indifference. But the reality of suffering and how it does transform us and lead us to union with God is a very important dimension of it.
But if it's others suffering, and you see that, they're not being praised.
Well, you don't know. You don't know. And, I think if you see other people suffering and if you can alleviate it, you're called to do that. Not to say, hey, that's a great gift. Stick with it. We're called to alleviate it. But again, all the different levels and dimensions of suffering, we can't eliminate those from either our lives or other people's lives. And learning to cope with suffering and to deal with suffering and be transformed by suffering is critical to that. It does lead us to God.
I was wondering on if you can talk about the false self and how that may equate with the crucifix, the symbol of Christ on the cross or somebody on the cross. As those images keep coming up in my head, it's kind of being one and the same. A lot of us are working hard to move out of the false self, but there's this sense of being stuck. And and that to me is like being stuck on the crucifix. And I think we need to come down and leave an empty cross.
Well, in Mark's gospel, it's the centurion who looks up at the crucified Jesus and says, truly, this is the Son of God. So it's his emptied self that is his true self, the kenosis, if you will. So I'm not urging you to stay on the cross if you feel that that's where you are. But what I'm saying is that this self-emptying or this abandonment of the false self and this realization of the true self does involve suffering. And that's what Paul says about Jesus, is that he abandoned his equality with God and became like a slave, even to death on a cross. That's the kenosis of Jesus. I don't know if I'm connecting with your question or not.
I just wondered if Richard Rohr speaks to that, if that's the night of,
The dark night of the soul?
Yeah.
No, the dark night of the soul is more the spiritual materialism of letting go of your running the spiritual path. I'm now on the way to discovering my true self, and I'm on the way of abandoning my false self. That's the dark night, is when you realize that's futile. We have time for one more question, and you're it.
Thank you. Just wanted to come back to the question that was raised earlier while you were speaking about what you said. Rohr was saying we have one shot at it, and as far as this life is concerned. And then to your point later in terms of what your interpretation of the resurrection is in relation to the true self.
Do you think resurrection has to do with reincarnation?
Well, I'm just trying to sense where is that question coming from many of us in terms of is the one shot that I think probably most of us are saying, well, that's as far as we know. But is the resurrection pointing us to a mystery that is depending upon anything beyond the here and now?
Let me just say a couple things. First of all, the resurrection is an announcement that the crucifixion didn't work. Okay? That God had reversed the judgment of Rome. So Rome's judgment is not God's judgment. And the judgment of Rome was an unjust judgment, and God's judgment is a just judgment. But the crucifixion was legal, and the resurrection was illegal. So it's a slap in the face at the emperor and all the false gods that maintain that this is the way you can control people. It's also the end of fear for not just for Jesus, but for his disciples. If you go back and read the resurrection narratives, what they're really about is a coming to faith, and because they don't recognize this person at all at first. Then this recognition, we talked about that a little bit, the God in me recognizes the God out there. Okay, there's a recognition, and then there's a call to mission. So all the resurrection narratives are all of those. They're not about a reincarnated life. In fact, they're not about a resuscitated life in any way. And it's only after the resurrection that what was hinted at and only vaguely understood in their encounter with Jesus in life becomes clear. Namely, this is the face of God. This is the Son of God. Now they see clearly the union of Jesus and God, the theophany. So every post-resurrection appearance is also a theophany. It's not about reincarnation. And it's not necessarily about what happens to us in death either. It's about what happens to us in life. That's a whole nother lecture. Thank you very much.